The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler, episode 898. Today, Amateur Traveler talks about Golden Age mansions and colonial homes, forts and taverns, the history of tolerance, and of the U.S. Navy, as we go to Newport, Rhode Island. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about Newport. I'd like to welcome to the show Phil Roberson from Rhode Island, who's come to talk to us about Newport, Rhode Island. Phil, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
And what's your connection with Rhode Island, first of all, and with Newport?
I'm an almost lifelong New Englander, but I've only been in Rhode Island for about 4 years in Middletown, Rhode Island, which is part of Newport County. But prior to that, I lived in New England and would often come down here with my girlfriend. It was our place away from home that we always wanted to make home. And finally, during the pandemic, we pulled the trigger and here we are.
Excellent. And why should someone go to Newport, Rhode Island?
There's a lot of reasons to want to come here, but if you love the ocean, if you love the Gilded Age kind of life, if you love history especially, there's just a lot to see in Newport. And I'll clarify that I'm really talking about Newport County, which includes a lot of places, but the city of Newport is obviously the most notable. But Rhode Island is known as the Ocean State, and nowhere epitomizes the Ocean State more than Newport County. Rhode Island has 400 miles of coastline, and that's pretty good for the smallest state in the United States.
That's surprising.
And it has, depending on how you count them, 30 to over 100 islands in Rhode Island. So the largest is commonly called Aquidneck Island, but officially and legally its name is Rhode Island, from where the state got its name. And in fact, until just a few years ago, the official name was the state of Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations.
Right.
The Providence Plantations being everything off island. But the big island of Rhode Island encompasses the city of Newport and the towns of Middletown and Portsmouth. And like I say, they're now called Aquidneck Island, but officially their name is still Rhode Island. The second biggest island in the state is Conanicut Island, which includes the entire town of Jamestown, which is also Newport County. And the third biggest island is Prudence Island, which is part of the town of Portsmouth. So that's the big chunk of Newport County. There are also two towns, Tiverton and Little Compton, that are off island to the north and towards Massachusetts. So that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about Newport County. It's the ocean part of the Ocean State. And Aquidneck Island / Rhode Island is on one side has Narragansett Harbor. On the other side has the Saconnet River, which is really just a tidal strait. It's not really a river. So we're surrounded by ocean everywhere you look. And that is a theme of the area and something you can't avoid and wouldn't want to avoid when you're here. But on top of that, there's a lot of history in Rhode Island. Originally, the city of Newport was one of 4 rotating centers of government for the state of Rhode Island. Government would rotate between, I think it was Providence, Bristol, Newport, and Warwick, until it finally, probably about 100 years ago, the official capital became Providence. But during the Revolutionary War and during the colonial period, Newport was the 4th largest city in the colonies. behind
Oh,
New York, Boston, and Philadelphia.
but not in that order. Philadelphia being the largest at that time.
I don't know. New York, I'm not sure. New York was pretty
New
big.
York was not as big until after the war.
Is that right? Yeah. And all of those cities, including Newport, featured heavily in the Revolutionary War. It's a deep water port, which has entered into its history both back then and then as a naval base. So it's got a lot of history that you also can't avoid. When you walk through Newport, you can't avoid the ocean or history. It's everywhere.
Excellent. What itinerary are you going to recommend for us?
I'm going to recommend several different days, and you can mix them up depending on the weather.
Sure.
Because if you want to go out to the beach or sailing and it's raining that day, there's plenty to do inside as well. But like I say, the ocean is a big attraction, and there's a lot of different ways to see it. In
Okay.
my mind, the best beaches in southern New England are in Newport County. There are 2 in Middletown and 1 public beach in Newport and a few private ones in Newport as well. So if you're a beach person, you've got warm water, you've got white sand, and it's great. But there's other ways to see the ocean as well. A big attraction in Newport is the Cliff Walk, which covers the southern peninsula of the city of Newport and basically goes in the backyard of the Newport mansions. So walking that, which is about a 3.5-mile hike from one end to the other, you get spectacular views of the ocean on one side and Gilded Age mansions on the other side. So that's one way to experience the ocean. There are other hikes that I'll talk about that bring you by the ocean, but I think if you're in the ocean state and if you're in Newport, you really need to get out on the water. And there's several ways to do that as well. Sailing in Narragansett Bay, you can rent a slot on a schooner or a sailing boat and get out onto the ocean. There are also ferries that ferry you around. Now, let me add a little bit about transportation, like getting here. There's no commercial air service to Newport. So most people will get here by car, usually through Providence if they fly in, maybe rent a car there, but you'll drive here. I honestly think most people that come here don't realize they're on an island because there's bridges, you drive directly here, but a car is important if you want to see the rest of Newport County other than the city of Newport. It's a liability in Newport itself, but it will get you to a lot of things that you can't see if you just stay in the city. There is a seasonal ferry that runs from Providence to Newport, so that's one way to access here. And I'm sure I know some people have private planes and private yachts, and they get to Newport that way. But most people are going to drive here one way or another.
Yeah, I'm sure I would be showing up on my private yacht, but not a listeners
Nor I.
has those.
But you'll see them all the time. Like I mentioned, there's a ferry from Providence. There are also a couple ferries in the harbor. So if you wanted to get out in the harbor, even just moving around the city of Newport or getting over to Jamestown, which is a separate island, there's a ferry service that will basically bring you in a circle to a lot of different major points in Newport and in Jamestown.
Okay.
One way to get out on the water is to just take the ferry, and you can get over to Jamestown, have lunch there. There are several restaurants in Jamestown.
And I'm assuming the ferry is a much less expensive option than doing, for instance, a sailing cruise or something like that.
Yeah, I forget the exact price, but it's cheap and it's a hop-on, hop-off ferry. It's not a car ferry, it's just a passenger ferry. And in fact, there is now, since the 1970s, a bridge that goes from Newport to Jamestown. But prior to that, the only way to cross was a car ferry. And so now it's really just a kind of a tourist commuter ferry, but it's hop-on, hop-off. It stops at several places in Newport, including Fort Adams that I'll talk about a little bit later. It also stops.
I already bookmarked Fort Adams as someplace I want to hear more about. Okay. Absolutely.
It also stops at a little island, and I can't remember the name of the lighthouse, but there's a lighthouse on a tiny island in the middle of the Narragansett Bay. And if you pay an extra small fee on the ferry, they'll drop you off there and they'll pick you up. So you could go there and spend the day on an island with a picnic lunch, see the lighthouse, etc., and then get back on the ferry to go to either Jamestown or Newport.
Now, is that the Rose Island?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And I'll admit, because I've only been here 4 years, some of these places I've not been to. I've been on the ferry that brings you to Rose Island, but I never got off there. It's on my list of places to see. So you definitely need to get out on the ocean probably a couple days, whether that's beach, cliff walk, taking a boat, taking a sailing boat. Some of the sailing boats will take you down out into the Narragansett Bay and with a commentary so you can actually hear and
Sure.
see what you're looking at. Depending on the weather, one of the first things you should do is get on, there's a trolley tour of Newport proper. And that leaves
Okay.
right from the transportation center in town. And it gives you a good overview because they bring you to some major areas that we'll talk about so you have a feel for where you are in the city and in the county. They'll also bring you along the ocean, bring you by the mansions, etc. And that's just a good way to get grounded and know where you are. I'm going to suggest for at least one day to take a walking tour of just downtown Newport with some history involved in it. And if you leave the trolley terminal and head east, you come up to Washington Square, which is a very historic part of downtown Newport. Washington Square is just a square that's surrounded by some very historic buildings. At the north end is the old Colony House, which was the seat of Rhode Island government, at least part-time. And if you're there on July 4th, they actually have a reenactor of a colonial soldier reading the Declaration of Independence from the balcony, as they did when the signed declaration was first distributed to the colonies and people learned what had happened in Philadelphia. So that can be very festive if you're there on July 4th weekend. The old Colony House is sometimes open for tours. They've got some interesting artwork there. Because it was the seat of government, it's just an interesting old colonial house to go into. And it dates from 1739. You're going to hear when I talk about places a lot of the oldest, the first, etc. And again, because Newport was a very old colonial town and one of the 4 largest cities at the time, there's
I
a lot
hate
of,
to correct you, but what I'm reading is it was the 5th largest. It was about a
whoopee to
thousand
say.
people less than Charleston. So we have to include that one southern city that was 4th. But
Liars.
there were only those 5 cities, though, that were above 10,000 in population in the colonial time. So nothing very big. And the largest was Philadelphia, was only 30,000. So the whole
Yes,
country was a lot smaller.
a lot smaller. And I will say, a little bit shamefully, that one of the things Newport shares with Charlestown is we had a big slave trade here.
Yep.
So anyway, when you're Washington Square, you go to the old Colony House. If you go just a little north, about 1 block north, is the White Horse Tavern, which is the oldest tavern in the U.S. Now, a lot of people claim that, and there's a lot of different ways to define that, but this is a building, a house that dates from 1673. So it's which is not an uncommon year for buildings in Newport. So it's very old. It's a tavern now, has been a tavern for most of its life. It used to be open for lunch and dinner. It's pretty much only open for dinner now, but there is an old bar and old fireplaces. And it's the type of place that George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette would dine in, and where both colonists and British occupying soldiers would meet and sleep and eat and drink. So it's a great building to see, and even better to go in and eat. Right across the street from there is the Friends Meeting House, which is
Okay.
the oldest surviving house of worship in Rhode Island, and it dates from 1699. It's open occasionally for visitors. I don't think it has regular hours, but it's this huge Quaker meeting house, timber frame with a large meeting area inside. So those are just to the north of Washington Square. If you go back to Washington Square, the square itself has the Perry Monument, which is in honor of Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, who was a famous naval commodore from the Battle of 1812. If you go to Toro Street, which is on the side of Washington Square, and head up Toro Street, you come to the Toro Synagogue, which is, again, the oldest existing synagogue in the U.S., and it dates from 1763. Rhode Island had a real history of religious tolerance. In fact, it was founded by people that left Massachusetts because they found Massachusetts too intolerant. The oldest synagogue is notable. Again, a place that I have not yet visited, but it's on my list. From the Toro Synagogue, basically heading south, there's several sights to see. You're going to see, just walking along the road, you'll see a lot of houses dating from the 16, 17, early 1800s. And these are beautifully restored. I should have mentioned how a lot of these things were restored. And a lot of that was due to Doris Duke. Doris Duke lived in Newport. She was an heiress, a tobacco heiress, who at the time was considered the wealthiest woman, not just in the U.S., but the wealthiest woman in the world. She inherited a fortune at age 12. And she's got a long history in Newport. She loved Newport and put a lot of money into it. She's also got a little bit of a questionable period when her personal assistant was run over by her car. And some people believe that she killed him deliberately. She was cleared very quickly by the Newport police at the time, but shortly after that donated tons of money to the city of Newport, including restoration of the cliff walk, which she had previously fought. And she also restored about 80 homes in Newport that were old wooden colonial era homes. So when you walk through downtown Newport, you're walking by these beautifully restored, they're like museum pieces. It's a city, so they're right next to the road, and you can run your hands down the siding and touch a piece of a house that was here before the Revolutionary War. There were 80 of those, so they're just everywhere you see. It's like walking through an architectural museum. It's really phenomenal. So going down from Toro Synagogue, you'll come to the Vernon House, which is down Spring Street. The Vernon House was the home of the Comte de Rochambeau, who was the commander of the French forces in Newport, and it's beautifully restored. They recently opened it up to the public. They may have closed it again. Doris Duke started the Newport Restoration Foundation, and they are the ones that are the caretakers of these houses. They're the ones that restored these houses.
Okay.
So they will sometimes open a house for a while and close it, open a museum and close it. A lot of the houses that they restored, they actually rent out now. And you can apply online to be one of their tenants in a beautiful antique colonial or Cape house. They handle all the maintenance. They have very strict requirements of what you can and cannot do, obviously, but it is really like walking through a museum in downtown Newport. So I mentioned the Vernon House. Keep going down Spring Street, you'll come to Trinity Church. And this is a church dating from 1725 that really overlooks Newport Harbor. George Washington attended service here in 1781. Gilbert Stuart was a parishioner. And if your listeners aren't familiar with who Gilbert Stuart was, look at a $1 bill and look at the picture of George Washington. He's the guy. He painted all the founding fathers and was a local Rhode Islander. Trinity Church is beautiful, and they're open for not just services, but you can just walk by and walk in, and often a guide will give you a little mini informal tour without a reservation or without a ticket. They obviously accept donations, but it's just a beautiful old piece of history. In front of Trinity Church is what's called Queen Anne Square, and that's this nice park that leads from the church down to the waterfront. Queen Anne Square, up until I believe the 1960s, was a dilapidated area with some industry, bars, etc. It didn't add much to the local appeal. And at one point, a furniture shop, I believe, burned down, and there was a big hole in the square, and the town tried to decide what should we do with this. And one of the plans was to turn it into a park, and Doris Duke took charge and, more importantly, funded it, and basically turned this old industrial area of the town into a beautiful park. So when you leave Trinity Church, you walk through this park and you walk right towards the harbor. It's a great place on a summer day to just hang out. Sometimes there are musicians there. Sometimes it's just people having a cup of coffee or something like that. Coming down Queen Anne Square towards the waterfront, you're now in the center of the city. North brings you back to Washington Square, and south brings you down to Thames Street with shopping and dining, etc. And any of you who may be familiar with London, this is Thames. And in Newport, it's pronounced Thames.
Thames, okay.
So I'm sure it's probably named after the river in London, but somehow the pronunciation has changed over the years. Across Thames Street and across what's now called America's Cup Boulevard are several of the wharfs. There's Bowen's Wharf, Bannister's Wharf, and in those there are small shops, fine dining, sailboats that go out into the harbor, etc. It's a great place to walk around and look. It's a great place to eat. It's a great place to shop. And if you want to get a seat on a boat, you can reserve one right there.
And do you have a favorite restaurant in that area?
Oh, there's so many restaurants here. I've got a list, and so many I've gone to, and every time I go to one, I say, well, that's my new favorite. But down on the wharf, there's the Mooring, which I really like. and you're right next to yachts docked right outside of it. The Black Pearl, I believe, is on Bowen's Wharf, and it's great. I'm trying to think some others right down there. There's one called, I think, 44 Bowen's Wharf, and then the Clark Cookhouse is another one right down there on the wharf. So there's great places. One thing I'd advise for anybody coming to Newport, particularly in the summer, but on a weekend almost any time, is make reservations. Because if you show up on the wharf at 7 o'clock and you want to go to dinner, they may not seat you for a few hours. These places do book up. There's a lot of restaurants, but there's a lot of people visiting the city. So I always tell friends, don't show up and visit me for the weekend and say, let's go out to dinner, because it's too late by then.
Now, in terms of times to come, summer is, I think, the only time I've been to Newport. Is that when you recommend, even though it's busier, or is there a better time of the year if you have some options?
Well, summer is great, and obviously the
Mhm.
rest of the world thinks that. So it's certainly the most crowded time of the year.
Right.
There are also cruise ships that come into the harbor. They've already started coming now, and we're talking in early May.
Right.
But there's certainly a lot of people in the summer, so a lot of crowds and maybe fewer options for lodging and restaurants. But it's also a great time to be on the beach, to be on the cliff walk, to be out on the water, etc.
Konnichiwa, I'm Yuki, a tour leader with Explore. Who knew that hidden among Tokyo's towering skyscrapers was a peaceful tea house surrounded by ancient trees and serene ponds? Actually, I knew. It was my mother's secret sanctuary. Not everyone knows about Tokyo's Hamarikyu Gardens. Arigatou gozaimasu. But you will if you explore. Search exploreworldwide.com and don't just travel, explore.
But there's a lot going on off-season as well. I used to go to Cape Cod for travels a lot, and Cape Cod just seems to shut down after Labor Day and before Memorial Day, and that doesn't really happen in Newport. There's always something going on and places open, and most of the restaurants are open. They may close for a couple weeks for renovations in the off-season when they're not as busy, but really any time of year is nice. I walked out on the cliff walk this winter during a snowstorm, and it was beautiful. So no, I don't recommend a time in particular unless you really are an outdoor person looking for beach and water excursions, in which case, sure, come with everybody else in July and August because it is beautiful.
You do host some of the biggest festivals in the city in July and August, so
That's
you're
true,
kind of
yeah.
inviting people for that time period.
Yeah, there are a lot of events going on. I think you're referring to the Newport Jazz Festival and the Newport Folk Festival.
I am indeed.
Yeah, and that's probably the busiest time of year when those are in town, and those last for about a week each, and usually they're 2 weeks apart. So things get very busy. Honestly, living around here in July and August, I go out to eat in Portsmouth or Middletown because it's just too hard to find a place in downtown Newport. But I have that luxury. There are a lot of other events too. There's a lot of different sailing events, races. Newport used to host the America's Cup. It doesn't anymore, but last summer there was some around the world sailing race, and one of the stops was Newport. And I was able to go down by Fort Adams and just watch the boats come in. And the first place boat was the U.S. boat. So you can find a lot of those at newportsailornetwork.com. They list all the events, and those are fun to watch. There's also an Audrain's Auto Museum in Newport, and they have in the fall their Concours d'Elegance, which is the fanciest of the fanciest car shows. It's like Pebble Beach of the East Coast. You see these beautifully preserved and restored cars from the early 1900s all the way through recent supercars and McLarens and things like that. They have a whole week's worth of events, and it culminates with the big Concours d'Elegance, which is usually on the lawn of one of the mansions. Last year it was on the lawn of the Breakers mansion. And that's a great event if you're a car person. And I can talk a little bit about car museums later because there's certainly a car culture down here in Newport. There's also the St. Patrick's Day Parade. If you're here that time of year, that's a big event in Newport. Rhode Island had one of the highest influxes of Irish immigrants, particularly in the late 1800s, as laborers. And I think we're only like fourth or fifth highest as far as Irish descendants now. But St. Patrick's Day Parade is a big event. And then there's a couple Irish pubs right there on the main street in Newport. And one other thing that's just I'm seeing on my list of events is the Newport Pell Bridge 4-mile race. So if you're a runner or even a walker, they have a race once a year in the fall where you go across the Newport Pell Bridge from Jamestown to Newport. And it's the only time of the year you can walk on that bridge. The bridge is vehicles only, but they close off one direction of travel on the bridge, and they bus you over to Jamestown, and 7:30 in the morning, you have a race across the bridge. It's practically a mile and a half straight up, and then a mile and a half down, and a mile to the finish line. So I'm just thinking as far as events, like actual regularly scheduled events.
I got you distracted. You got us as far as the piers and themes or
Thames Street, yes. I will say that on Thames Street, going north or south, there are a lot of restaurants and a lot of shops. Lower Thames has probably more. You get a lot of pedestrian traffic down there. You could spend the day either shopping for artwork or antiques or just touristy things and stopping at several different restaurants down that way. There's the Red Parrot, there's the Midtown Oyster Bar, there's a Landing restaurant down in Lower Thames, O'Brien's Pub, which gets a good college crowd down that way. At the Deck is another restaurant down that way that I've been to several times. So there's a lot to do down in that direction. And that's a good walking. I think that kind of wraps up the walking tour of Newport. Okay. You could easily break that into a couple days as well. Another, at least one day, could be spent seeing the Newport mansions. Most of the mansions are run by the Preservation Society of Newport, and that's separate from Doris Duke's Newport Restoration Foundation. But newportmansions.org, I believe it is, lists all the mansions, and these are opulent. These were the rich of the rich. This was before people talk about division of inequity of income. It's nothing like it was in the late 1800s. And if you want to see some of these on TV, anybody who's watched The Gilded Age on HBO, almost all the indoor scenes were shot at these mansions, and some of the outdoor scenes were as well. So there's the Breakers, the Elms, the Marble House, Chateau sur Mer, and all of these are available for tours through the Preservation Society of Newport. There's one other mansion which is not run by them, which is Rough Point, and that's operated by the Newport Restoration Foundation, and that was Doris Duke's childhood home, and she lived there for a lot of her adult life. She had several homes, including New York, New Jersey, and Hawaii, and would travel a lot, but she spent a lot of her later years at Rough Point. And almost all these mansions are right on that cliff walk. So it's great one day to see them from the cliff walk with the ocean at your back, and another day to be inside and looking at the views these people had and the richest of the rich and all the decorations. I think Doris Duke's house has a Renoir painting and a Van Dyck still in the house. So you could easily spend one day or possibly 2 days just visiting mansions, and maybe you'd want to break that up with other things in between. There's also a free hop-on, hop-off trolley during the summer. I think they call it routes 67 and 68, and those go right by the mansions and go basically near Easton's Beach, which is the beach in Newport. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of old houses to visit as well. The Hunter House and the Vernon House are owned by the Newport Restoration Foundation and run by them. Other outdoor activities, and some of these are going to get you outside of Newport City proper. There are 3 wineries that I'm aware of in Newport County. There's Newport Vineyards, which is in Middletown, and it's probably one of the biggest. Greenvale Vineyards is in Portsmouth, and it's my personal favorite because it's an old carriage house that they've turned into a winery, and you look out over the Sakonnet River, and both of them will host weddings and events and things like that. And then there's Sakonnet River Winery that's over in Little Compton, and I believe that was founded by the founder of Alex and Ani, the retail chain. Other outdoor things to do, there's a local minor league baseball team, the Newport Gulls, and they play at Cardines Field right in downtown Newport. Another thing on my list that I haven't quite gotten to yet, there are polo matches at polo fields in Portsmouth all summer long. So grab a chair, watch a polo match. If you've never seen that, it's pretty impressive seeing herds of horses thundering down a field. There are a few golf courses on the island, a few public ones, and a couple private ones as well. There's Newport National, which is in Middletown, Green Valley, which is in Portsmouth, and Jamestown, I think it's just called the Jamestown Golf Course in Jamestown, over the bridge. For a little more adventurous people, at the Newport Airport, there's skydiving, Skydive Newport, and there are helicopter tours if you'd rather stay in the aircraft. And I've done the helicopter tours, and if you pick a beautiful day with a blue sky, it flies right over the harbor. It flies by all the mansions, over the beaches and everything. It really gives you an incredible view of the area you're in. I mentioned trails earlier. I mentioned the Cliff Walk, which is probably the most popular, but there's also a place in Middletown called Setuas Point National Wildlife Refuge. And this is 242 acres on a peninsula jutting out into the ocean. And it's in Middletown. It actually used to be an observation point for the military. They had guns and observation points. They were disguised as houses and barns during World War II and World War I even. But now it's just a national wildlife refuge. And if you go there in the morning, you're guaranteed to see deer and rabbits and things like that. I usually go there a little after sunrise and see easily a dozen or 2 dozen deer out there with the ocean on one side, with waterfowl and everything. It's really a beautiful nature place. And it's about a little over 2 miles round trip hiking trail. There's also the Aquidneck Land Trust, which owns or preserves a lot of the land on the island, and they've got all sorts of hiking trails. So there's a lot of places to get outside, hike, see wildlife, see scenery, etc. I mentioned that Newport County is a lot more than Newport, and to see it, you really need a car. You really need to get out of the city itself. So a couple real nice drives to take. One is to go across the Newport Pell Bridge to Jamestown. And at the southern tip of Jamestown is the Beavertail State Park. And there's one of the oldest lighthouse locations in the U.S. The current lighthouse isn't as old as the location, but there used to be an even older lighthouse there. And they've got a great park right on the ocean. I've gone there to see sailing races with the sailboats going around the island. Great place for a picnic lunch, etc. Going in another direction, you can go across the Saconnet River in Portsmouth to Tiverton. And there's Tiverton, Four Corners, and Little Compton, which are the 2 towns that are not on islands in Newport County. And it's almost like you're in another world over there. It's very pastoral. There's farm stands, some antique stores, a beach at the southern end, but it's very peaceful and very quiet New England countryside. You wouldn't even think you're in the same state as the city of Newport. It is really beautiful. And another drive you can take, either with your own car, or there's a place that rents these little 3-wheel scooters right in downtown Newport. But the drive is Ocean Drive that brings you by Brenton State Park. And this brings you to the southern tip of the city of Newport, just open ocean for as far as you can see. You drive by the homes of people like Jay Leno and Judge Judy and Larry Ellison, and eventually end up at the mansions, the front door of the mansions. And this is the richest of the rich. It is truly opulent, it's truly over the top, and it's a nice drive. Sometimes I'll take the drive just on my car or motorcycle just to get out and see the ocean. It's really beautiful.
Got it. A couple places you haven't mentioned yet. Fort Adams, and then there also the Sailing Museum is the other one I wondered if you were going to mention.
Yeah, I'll tell you that museums, great thing to save for a rainy day. There are a lot of museums in Newport. There's a Museum of Newport History, which is right in downtown, and they've got a great little museum upstairs and shop downstairs. And Museum of Newport History, or the Newport, I think it's Newport Historical Society, they also run narrated walking tours of downtown Newport. And those are great. So they'll have them with different themes. It could be Revolutionary War history. It could be African American history. It could be the Gilded Age, etc. They run all sorts of walking tours, and they're, I want to say, about 30, 40 minutes, and led by an informative guide, and those are great. The National Sailing Hall of Fame is in downtown Newport. That's on my list of haven't gotten there yet. And the International Tennis Hall of Fame is right on Bellevue Ave at the foot of the road that leads to all the mansions. They hosted the U.S. Open probably 100 or more years ago. They've got grass courts. There used to be an old casino right there. And so those are kind of museum places. Newport Art Museum is up that way, and I like my museums on the small side. Newport Art Museum has a wonderful collection in a couple buildings,
Oh,
easy way to while away a couple hours. The Redwood Library in Athenaeum, which is America's first purpose-built library. It was built in 1747 as a library. And then there are two car museums. There's Audrain's Auto Museum, which I mentioned runs the Concours event, but they've got a rotating exhibit right on Bellevue Ave, right next to the National Sailing Hall of Fame. They promote a lot of things in town. They have cars and coffee events. They have car shows. So they have a rotating exhibit with various topics. It could be U.S. land yacht cars from the 1950s or modern Japanese technology or old cars. We're talking 1903, 1905 cars when we'd barely gone from making horse carriages with motors. So that's a great organization and a great museum to visit. At the other end of the island in Portsmouth is the Newport Car Museum, and that's a separate museum. They have a more permanent collection of mostly U.S. muscle cars, but they've got every iteration of Corvette and Mustang and you name it. It's a great museum as well. One other museum I have not yet been to is the Naval War College Museum. Now, I'd briefly mentioned that the Navy figures heavily in Newport's history. Newport used to be the home of the Atlantic Fleet. That's where all the destroyers in the Atlantic Fleet were birthed until the 1970s. And there's still a huge naval station there, but the fleet is no longer there. One thing that is there is the Naval War College Museum, and that you do have to plan ahead to go because you can't just show up. You need to have a reservation and I think be vetted by the military. They probably run a background check on you. The Navy base itself is still fairly protected. You can't just wander in, obviously. One time my GPS, when I first moved here, it told me to go down a road that brought me right through the museum, and I was quickly greeted by a sailor with an M16, and he made it clear that I wasn't to drive that way. You can go to the Naval War College Museum. You just have to reserve it and fill out an application. They want to know who's coming onto the base.
Okay.
They also occasionally have a car event. Like once a year, they usually have a car event on the lawn. And I went to that once, and I did register ahead of time. And I noticed the cars that hadn't registered, they got a full security check, mirrors underneath the car, taking your trunk apart and all that. And when the girl found out I had a reservation, she was somewhat relieved because it was a simpler process at that point. And the last thing, which is a museum, but also a very special thing to visit, is Fort Adams. Now, Fort Adams basically guards the entrance to Narragansett Bay. And it is a huge fort. It was built in the early 1800s, named after President Adams. And
which President Adams?
With the first President Adams, John Adams, not his son. And it's so large that in the parade ground inside the fort, you could fit Fort McHenry, Fort Ticonderoga, and Fort Sumter combined. It is that big a parade ground and that big an area. Tons of gun ports facing out over the harbor, none of which have ever been fired in anger. It was a big training ground in both World Wars for Navy personnel. You can go there and either do a self-guided tour with a little app they have, or you can join one of their formal tours. And I highly recommend the latter because then they bring you places you couldn't go on your own, including underground tunnels. They had listening tunnels. The fort basically was three sides with water, so the only way you could approach it from land was from the south. And they had all sorts of redoubts and gun stations there, but they also had underground tunnels so they could go and listen if someone else was trying to tunnel in.
Right.
They'll bring you down there if you go in the formal tour. On a beautiful day, there's spectacular views of the bay and the harbor. And Fort Adams is what hosts the Newport Folk Festival and the Newport Jazz Festival. It's right on their ground.
Okay. I didn't realize that. Okay.
Yeah, so usually the backdrop is the stage backs right up to the fort, and the lawn is where the audience is. On the back side of the fort, there's another park, and there's the Eisenhower House. And that was the summer home of Dwight Eisenhower when he was president. They called it the Summer White House for Eisenhower. That's run by the Rhode Island State Parks, I believe. And you can see why he'd want to spend his summers there. It's on a hill, and you get nice breezes off the ocean. in the middle of summer, and it's just a wonderful place.
Hmm.
Another president that spent his summers in Newport was JFK. And Jackie Bouvier, Jacqueline Kennedy / Jacqueline Onassis, grew up in Newport, and their wedding reception was at her childhood home. They got married at St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church, which was Rhode Island's first Roman Catholic parish. It dates from 1828, and that's where JFK and Jackie got married. So there's a lot of presidential history here as well. That's the bulk of the big locations and events. One other place I'll just mention briefly, again, I've not been there, but it's also owned by the Newport Restoration Foundation, is some topiary gardens. And those are in Portsmouth. And supposedly, again, I'm using the word oldest, but the oldest topiary garden in the nation. So there's a lot of history, whether it comes to architecture or churches or military, you name it. I feel like I gave the Navy a little bit of short shrift because they're definitely a huge influence in this area. In fact, when they built the Newport Pell Bridge, the Navy basically required they build it high enough to meet their standards for battleships and aircraft carriers and things like that. And it still employs, I believe, over 4,000 people, the Navy base does, even though the fleet isn't there. They used Narragansett Bay for torpedo testing and training. It's just a big part of the history and culture of the county.
Excellent. Sounds like we're winding down here. Anything else before we get to our wrap-up questions? Before you go to Newport, you really need to know what?
One other thing I'm just seeing on my list I hadn't really talked about. We talked briefly about some restaurants by the docks. Some other places I would recommend. There's a place called Bell Cafe, which for breakfast is right on the water, right in the shipyard. You have to park outside of the shipyard and walk across it to get there. But there's outdoor dining right on the water, and you're missing out if you don't have breakfast there at some point. There are also several Irish pubs right on Thames Street. Busker's Irish Cafe. There's a Brick Alley Pub in Barcino. One other place that I've been to that I really liked was there's a Hotel Viking, which is an old hotel in Newport. And they're up on the hill, and they have a deck up there. So you could have cocktails or a meal on the deck overlooking the entire Newport Harbor, which is wonderful. So I feel like I didn't give enough places to eat, but there are certainly a lot.
I think we're good.
Yeah.
Those are the things that, unfortunately, with different episodes, those are the things that can change the most, obviously, from when we record it to when people listen.
I'm sure. Yeah.
As we go to wrap this up, you are standing in the prettiest spot in Newport. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
There's a couple places you can be standing and looking at the same thing.
Okay.
And I would say that's on the southern tip of the city of Newport, looking west over Narragansett Bay at sunset. And specifically on the lawn of Castle Hill Inn, which is a inn/restaurant on the southern tip that has outdoor dining, indoor dining, and a lawn with Adirondack chairs. So sitting there with a drink in your hand, looking at the bay and looking at the sunset over the Newport Pell Bridge is just spectacular.
Excellent. And is there a particular drink we should have in our hand in Newport?
I can't speak to that.
Okay.
I'd say whatever your favorite is, they'll make it for sure.
Excellent. And one thing that makes you laugh and say only in Newport.
I think if you were down on the wharf and you're, let's say, at the mooring, and on one side of you are these mega yachts, like you can't imagine how much these cost, more than the gross national product of most nations on one side. On the other side are supercars in the parking lot of people dining there, and you're just surrounded by this opulence. I don't think you'd find that scene most other places in the country.
Interesting. Yeah, you might have to go to Monaco to get that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And if you had to summarize Newport in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
I would use ocean, opulence, and old.
Excellent. Excellent. Our guest again has been Phil Roberson. And Phil, thanks so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your obvious love for Newport.
Thanks for having me, and hope to see you down here someday.
A special thanks to the patrons of the show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. If you're interested in how you can support the show or what a patron will get for that, go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler to learn more. And a special thanks to our latest patron, Daniel Perlman. Welcome, Daniel, and thanks. One of the things that you'll get as a patron of the show is the first chance to sign up for an amateur traveler trip. We're doing those annually again. We were just in Morocco, as you heard in last week's show. And then next year is Cuba in February. That trip has now filled up. There are spots on the waiting list, and typically somebody's going to have to cancel. So the first few slots on the waiting list are probably pretty important. If you're interested in more information about that, go to amateurtraveler.com/trips or just drop me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. I did want to say a farewell to Mark Peacock, who started his travel podcast a month before me, the Travel Commons podcast. Mine was about places to go to, and his was more about the road warrior. And so almost the opposite of amateur traveler. Mine was travel for the love of it, and his was all of the things that might happen when you travel, especially if you're on the road all the time. Mark did not put out as many episodes as I have. He's put out 200 episodes in 19 years, and I'm heading towards episode 900. But Mark has brought a halt to Travel Commons, and thank you for 19 years of enjoyment there, Mark. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more